Welcome back to the Reality Report. Yesterday we had the chance to sit down with former IRS Special Investigator Joseph Banister from freedomabovefortune.com to find out who the real terrorists are in America. Last week, Joseph Stack flew a plane into the IRS building. You know, there's a lot of people in this country that have issues with the IRS. You used to work inside their offices. You no longer work there. You know, I want to talk to you about what goes on in the back rooms of the IRS. What do the IRS agents say? How do they feel about the American people? And, you know, how do you think the IRS is going to respond to this action?
Well, Gary, as you know, I worked for the IRS for about 5.5 years, and so I participated in a number of luncheon discussions, you know, where all the agents get around the table and have their lunch and talk about whatever they want to talk about. And unfortunately, in my experience, IRS agents tend to have a very negative view about the public. And of course, this is all behind closed doors, behind the walls of the IRS. But generally, a very negative view of the public. They view most of the people in the public as tax cheats. And I encountered a fair amount of ridicule. They'll actually ridicule the public. And of course, I wasn't really comfortable with that. I wasn't comfortable with it at all. But I definitely experienced that when I worked there.
Now, you're no longer with the IRS. Tell me what it was, why you left the IRS.
Well, about midway through the 5.5 year period, about 3 years into my career there, I was exposed to a claim that someone made on a talk radio show that the administration and enforcement of the income tax was actually being done beyond the authority of the IRS. So in other words, people who weren't required to really pay the income tax were being treated as if they had to pay it by the IRS. The basic claim was that most Americans weren't required to pay a tax on their labor. And so I went and investigated that claim over a 2-year period on evenings and weekends while I still served as a special agent at the IRS. And I eventually had to conclude that those claims about the income tax were largely true, that the IRS was basically deceiving the public as to what their tax obligations were. And so I went to my supervisors at the IRS and I confronted them with this information. And I had done my very best to validate it, and I came to the conclusion that it was actually true. And I hoped that they would at least evaluate what I had found and give me some answer one way or the other that I had somehow there was an error to my analysis in some way, or that I was onto something. But instead they refused to talk to me about my investigation or any of the evidence and invited me to resign from the IRS.
So you raised questions, they asked you to resign based on the legitimacy of collecting taxes on the American people.
Yes, I reminded them that I had taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And of course, all the people that I presented my information to had taken the same oath. So I expected at least some kind of review of the evidence that I had accumulated. And this wasn't evidence that I generated by myself. I simply went out and collected it and then verified and validated it so that it looked solid, at least to me, with the investigative experience and training that the IRS had given me. And when I presented this information and evidence to my superiors at the IRS, they said they weren't going to look at it at all, and they invited me to resign. And I did resign. I had a very good reputation at the IRS, and I was quite frankly afraid that they might try to soil my reputation. So I thought it would be a lot safer if I accepted their invitation and resigned.
Joe, the tactics that the IRS uses against the American people, are these tactics constitutional? Are they obeying their oaths of office in the IRS?
In my opinion, no. I could not have continued in my work based on what I had learned about how the IRS, does what they do and where the limitations are on their authority. The problem is that the vast majority of agents, in my opinion, are not interested in looking to see what the limitations of their authority might be. They simply rely on what their supervisors have told them the limitations on their authority might be, if any. And so the average employee will simply rely on what their boss tells them is okay, rather than taking the time to evaluate whether the law actually sanctions what it is they're doing.
Now, Joseph Stack flew his plane into the IRS building because he was obviously a target of the IRS. When the IRS targets individual Americans, I mean, it has a psychological impact because that person tells their friend, "Oh my goodness, I'm getting audited," and this subliminal fear kind of creeps through America. How do you think the IRS is responding now? What words do you think are being felt, or shockwaves, I should say, within the halls of the IRS today?
Well, believe it or not, the IRS is very concerned with its image. I mean, it's really impossible for them to polish their image very much because of the kind of job that they do and what they do to people. But they are still very concerned with their image, and they somehow try to piece together the best image, the best face that they can. So I can also tell you that they have a public relations division or arm that is always active, always trying to be proactive. There's a huge, I'm sorry, but what I call it now is a propaganda arm, but a press office that is always actively looking to polish the IRS's image and always permeate society with this ongoing fear of the IRS in a very subtle way, because they don't want to seem overbearing, but they always like to, what they'll use is their minions in the media to convey the fear. And they won't actually be saying it themselves, but they'll use the media to put that fear, fear of God into the average American.